Um, Let me quickly introduce myself. I'm a project manager by profession, and I'm very passionate about education reform. I'm also the host of the podcast titled Learn and Unlearn, and I'm the author of the Amazon ebook, Wealth Mindset First, Strategies Next. My vision is a world where children are prepared for life during their education and not just prepared to make a living. My mission is to bring the benefits of lean and agile mindset and practices to the Indian education system. Let's get started with the 10 key areas of focus. So, the first one is to build character, and character is who we are at the core. And in my opinion, these are the key qualities of someone with great character. So, the first one is high self esteem, and high integrity, mental toughness, and we all know how important it is. Taking ownership, loyalty, and courage. Courage is required at every step of our lives. And I love this quote: the level of our success is determined by the level of our character. The second area of focus is on holistic health. We need to use a combination of ancient knowledge and the latest technological advancements to achieve holistic health. And we need to attend to all the four aspects of health: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. The third key area of focus is to help our children discover their passion or purpose. It's known by various names. In Japanese, it's called Ikigai, and in Sanskrit, it's called Swadharma. So, the advantage of this is that it helps in choosing relevant subjects or professions, and it also brings meaning and fulfillment to our lives. And I'm sure you would agree how important fulfillment is to our lives. I love what Mark Twain has said. The two most important days in our life are the day we were born and the day we find out why. The fourth area of focus is on wealth mindset and techniques. We need to build a wealth and abundance mindset in our children by recognizing and appreciating the abundance that we have in our lives. And we also need to let go of limiting beliefs about money. So, when I say limiting beliefs, here are some of the limiting beliefs about wealth. Money is the root cause of all evil. So, wealth by itself is not good or bad, it just amplifies who we already are. The next is money is materialistic. No, it's not materialistic, it is spiritual, it is energy, because we have to focus on others to earn money. And the next one, money is biased. No, money is not biased. It just goes to the people who add value. It's neutral. Money cannot buy happiness. Money by itself, wealth by itself may not be able to buy happiness, but wealth, we can buy time using money, and we can use that time to do things that bring happiness. The next limiting belief is there should be a limit on the wealth a person can make. So, for this, I would like to ask a question: is there a limit to the value that we can add to the world? No. So, why should there be a limit to the wealth a person can make? So, going back to the previous slide, we need to let go of some of these limiting beliefs about money. And I've intentionally put financial literacy at the bottom, because even if we have financial literacy, and in case we don't have the proper mindset about wealth, it's not going to be of much use. So, to summarize, money is a byproduct of value creation, and money is energy. So, we might have come across these terms called filthy rich and stinking rich. So, these need to be used as examples of oxymorons. I love what Naval Ravikant has quoted. If you secretly despise wealth, it will elude you. So it's very important, again, that we have the right mindset about wealth. The fifth area of focus is to help our children develop an entrepreneurial mindset. And the some of the key advantages are it improves resourcefulness, it expands our comfort zone, it improves our problem solving abilities, and it also helps in discovering hidden talents. And I'm talking from personal experience. So, does it mean that we encourage all our children to become entrepreneurs? No. Ron Malhotra says this beautifully. There is nothing wrong with being an employee, and but there is everything wrong with having an employee mindset. The sixth area of focus is on goal setting. And goal setting provides clarity on what is important to us. It also provides focus on where we need to spend our precious time and energy. It also improves productivity, and it has many more advantages. And we need to use goal setting at the workplace. It could be in different forms, OKRs or any other form. So of goal setting. So why not teach this during education? And here are the key goal areas that we need to focus on: health, personal, finance, as well as our growth. So Jim Rohn puts this beautifully. If you if we don't design our life plan, chances are we will fall into someone else's plan. And guess what they have planned for us? Not much. The seventh area of focus is time management. We need to teach our children that time is a limited currency that we are all born with. Time is energy and time is money. It's very important that we spend time for ourselves, for introspection and rejuvenation. That is our me time. We also need to invest in our self development in terms of our learning. So, learning time is very important. And lastly, family or vacation time. Spending time with our friends and family is also very important. We need to think of time as an investment. What can I spend time on today that will increase the value of my time tomorrow? And it is very important to teach our children to trade value for money and not time for money. The eighth area of focus is to find the right mentors. And why is it important to find the right mentors? Because mentors collapse time for us. They condense their years of experience and help us accelerate our journey from maybe a few years to a few months. Now, there are a few people who are fascinated about DIY, do it yourself. So, do it yourself, yes, it is good, but it cannot be applied to all activities because we don't have all the time in the world to do everything ourselves. And it also ties back to the previous slide, time as an investment. So we need to invest in mentors so that we can accelerate our journey. The ninth area of focus is to learn how to think. We need to ask the right questions, deep and profound questions. We need to also learn to think independently without having any herd mentality. We also need to see the short term impact versus the long term impact. It could be positive or negative. And the last and very important is to provide a nourishing environment to our children. We are the average of the people who we surround ourselves with. And our environment is more powerful than our willpower. And you can see that these areas of focus also contribute to the 21st century skills. And lastly, this is what I believe in. Every child has the right to education and the right to the right education. And I feel these areas of focus are a step towards providing our children the right education. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Gautam, does anybody have any questions? I actually have one. It's been a little while, Gautam, since we've spoken. And so, now with a better picture of what your vision is and the 10 areas, the 10 skill sets that, you want to be focusing on bringing out in India, I'm just curious, how has the journey been going so far?
I reached out to a couple of schools, but I haven't found leads yet. There is one person who I need to contact tomorrow. But yes, I want to get started with one school at least.
All right, so you're looking to start developing some incremental value so that you can begin experimenting your way towards, how to refine the process to kind of bring that out. Okay, excellent. Does
Yes.
anybody have any other questions? Simon?
Yeah, I've got a question. Gautam, thank you for that wonderful presentation. It was very thought-provoking. I'm curious to know if you might take a minute to just share whatever bits that you feel comfortable sharing of just sort of your own Agile journey. I'm always interested to hear how people come to this place of shared understanding, and I've never met two roots that were the same. So anything you'd care to share about yours, I would be keen to hear.
Sure. So I have used Agile probably for around 13 plus years across various industries. Could be travel, consumer packaged goods, and finance or payments. And I started feeling that this can be used in education as well. And that's my story. I started posting on LinkedIn about my thoughts on how Agile can help. And in fact, I didn't know at that point that Leaf existed, and then it's already being done. And somehow, Jeff or Roslyn, I guess they responded, and that's where the journey started. So I feel Kanban and Scrum, like they can be, and the lean practices as well to improve efficiency can be used very effectively within education system.
Awesome. Totally agree.
Thank you.
Excellent. Anyone else? Let me just check the chat to see if we have any.
Jeff, because I'm nosy, I've always got more questions.
Sure.
One of my questions would then be to Gautam. So what are some of the things we people on this call need to do or could do next to advance this cause that you've so eloquently described?
So these 10 areas of focus are something which we need to pay attention to as well as parents and educators. And a lot of things, right? It also boils down to how we conduct ourselves as well. There are some of the things which we, of course, need to teach our children, and there are things that we need to bring into our lives as well. So I think that's very important, especially the wealth mindset, goal setting, time management, and encouraging our children to have an entrepreneurial mindset. Because what I have seen is that there's a lot of there's a kind of focus on rote learning and not much on the entrepreneurial aspects, at least here in India. Of course, there are various boards, and there are children who are following this, but it's not widespread.
Thanks.
All right. Anything else? If not, we will move on to Paul Magnuson. Paul, let me go ahead and make you a presenter.
Yep. Thanks, Gautam, for that.
You are now able to present.
Okay, I'm sharing. Getting there.
Hey, Paul, while you're pulling that up, can you just tell us about where your school is located in Switzerland?
Yep, I'll give a little intro here. We got it there?
Yep, coming through live.
Thumbs up? Yep, okay, thanks. Yep, I'm at Lausanne American School in Switzerland. I'm above Lake Geneva at about 1,300 meters, right next to the ski slope. If it were daytime, I'd be looking out over the valley and the mountains on the other side, and the other boarding schools that start over there, and then the other boarding schools that are down around the lake and so on. It's a really, really beautiful area. So thanks for having me here today. I've got just a few slides to sort of back up what I'm talking about. And I'm going to talk from the angle of working in a school where grades 7 through 12 in the American system, so ages 12 through 18 or 19. And my latest project has been working with a group of elective courses, so ones that students can opt into, called EDGE. And we're trying to be a little bit edgy in how we do things. It's very much informed by 6-7 years now of work with pulling Agile into education. The chamois that you see here, I often feel like I'm the one that's looking over the edge, like I'm trying to push as far as we can. I've got some people following me, but they're often looking over their shoulders, wondering what the parents are thinking, wondering what the administration is thinking, wondering what others are thinking, and so on. So we're there. I often am looking over my shoulder too, to be completely honest. I'm trying to be that visionary. I've got others who are helping, but we're all a little nervous because we are working on the edge. We're a traditional boarding school of 300 students. We have the International Baccalaureate. We have traditional classes, traditional bell schedule, everything that you can think of in a traditional school, and then enhanced by the fact that we have quite good resources and we're in a beautiful spot of the world. Okay, so I started here by developing a professional development arm of the school for in-house professional development, and we focused on these 4 areas: autonomy, choice, collaboration, and a commitment to things that are ongoing instead of one shot. And I decided as I was preparing this to use that as my focus. Although I'm talking about the student programming that we're doing, it was interesting as I was looking at, like, how can I put this into just a few slides? I'm going to put it into these 4 slides. For professional development for adults, we know from the literature that this is important. Yet when we think about how we do traditional school, we sort of forget all of these very quickly. Or we blame the system and say, well, we can't have that because of this, that, and the other thing. But as Will Richardson said recently, just yesterday, I think I saw this post, it's like, we can't get around saying the things that we're doing in school, traditional or not, we are making those choices, right? And we may be making those choices because it's difficult to change. Universities want this, whatever it is, but we're still making the choice of doing school how we're doing it currently, and there's probably much better ways to go about it. One of them would be to take the good practice that we know and actually use it in our schools. So that's what I'm looking at. That's where our Agile work has gotten us so far. So these 4 things: autonomy and agency. For each of the 4, I'll tell a little story. The story here, this is a recent class. These students are working on their own in groups. This one group that's in the foreground is not working. If I would get behind them and look at their computers, they might swipe quickly to a new screen, but they are absolutely just off task. In one way, is a sort of a disaster. The group that you see by the window, they went over, found a place to work, and they're working hard, and they're going to actually complete this project, right? Interestingly, the focus on student agency is more for that group in front than the group in back. Anybody coming to visit the class, I'm going to show them the group in back because it looks successful. But it's the group in front that doesn't have a sense of student agency that actually needs that help. Now, there's some really big implications, right? We're trying not to do carrot and stick. We're trying not to be control freaks, but that's often, but we are in schools. But it has huge implications for classroom management, grading, and so on. We've actually thrown out grading. So I start the class by saying, we don't have grades. I don't have that carrot nor that stick. You got to learn how to work for yourself because you actually want to work. The group in the back has figured it out. The group in the front has a ways to go. Choice. So often in the way we have set up schools currently, there is very little choice. You get put into certain classes. We know what those traditional subjects are. If we all named it, no matter what country you're in right now, we're going to come up with the same about 8 subject areas. It doesn't need to be that way, right? The fact that we continue to do it is our choice, as Will Richardson said. But there's huge implications here, right? If we design our curriculum before we ever see a single student that's going to be doing that curriculum, we've put into place one of the biggest push systems you can ever imagine. Like, when do the students get to pull? When do they get some choice? It's amazing that we do it this way, but we feel like we're sort of locked in, and our documentations and transcripts and so on just emphasize that even further. I suppose there's a bunch of other reasons why we tend to circle around sort of a tight inner core of what education has to be, and when you get further out to the edge, you get more in danger of looking sort of crazy, I guess, and getting pushed back to the center. This student, Camilo, was in my experimental piano class last year. I taught piano, but it's not really fair to say I taught piano. I gave them pianos and they were supposed to learn by themselves. When they pulled me in at the right times, I gave them instruction then. Camilo was not liking piano. He was probably put in that class because the traditional schedulers in schools put you in a certain number of classes to even out the number of students across the entire school so that each group of students is roughly the same size and can each be with one teacher. It's a ridiculous system if you think about it. Camilo was not happy. He wasn't very good on rhythm. So I took him, and this is just lucky, I took him next door to the rock school class. This is another one of our edge classes, and asked the instructor there to show him some rhythm on the drums. He played for about 5 minutes and he was hooked. He didn't even come back to class that day. I just left him there and he was able to then learn drums. It's amazing that such a little thing should be a story, but it is, because it's rarely possible to simply switch and have a choice to switch and be in something else. But why we would build school in such a way that we can't do that seems sort of silly. Collaboration, as far as Gautam, as you mentioned, I'm sure all of us will mention, as far as 21st century skills and what you need to learn and what's transferable and so on, it's huge. For any of you who have worked with EduScrum, you'll probably recognize this as some team captains were putting together teams for a project. So these 4 were going to build together 4 different teams. They were looking at pages, each page from one student and the rest of the class. The students had written down what they were good at. And then without seeing their names, these groups, these 4 students had to put together 4 groups that would work together based on what the combined skills were. They needed somebody who was good at web design and somebody who was good at writing text and so on. Someone who was a leader and so on. That they worked great on this particular day. I love this picture because it makes me feel successful, at least that day. What we need to teach students, obviously, to learn from each other and to learn to work with each other. There's huge implications, though, for how we're currently doing things. Assessment and grading, which is most often, don't look at your neighbor's paper, do it yourself, right? And then the way we deploy teachers with one teacher with a group of students, we don't get to model collaboration because we put one teacher in a group with students most often. There's exceptions, but most often. And then we really need this ongoing nature. We've broken things into blocks, and then you learn something for a theoretical future. And when you get done with that unit, or when you get done with that class, you get effectively a check in the box in the margin. You've done that and you move on. Anybody who's ever taught math has had the student come up and say, well, multiple students probably every year, right? I've already done this, right? Like, this isn't for me. I've already done this. But of course you've already done this. You've done it in some aspect. Learning is actually cyclical. We could be teaching students to learn in a way that perhaps gives them the true belief that they are in the business of learning to learn and not just checking the box for one particular unit and so on. There's huge implications there for instruction, curriculum assessment, just everything. This particular student had first in the middle school where we were very intentional and spoke directly about using Kanban boards, etc. She graduated in the 10th grade into the business class, and she's holding up the money that she earned from the first catered dinner that she did for visitors. She earned quite a bit of money from that particular evening. That was in 10th grade. 2 years later, she's still running her own business. She wrote to me recently, she's a senior now. She wrote to me recently and said, when I came to this school, I thought it was all about grades and getting the best grades. That was like what you did. And she said, I've come to know through working in your edge classes that actually it's about learning a skill that you're passionate about and pursuing what you love and so on. I'm going to go to culinary school. That was a business that she's been running. She's thrilled with it. It's what she does. It's her thing. But I'm living on the edge here because I don't know if her parents are going to be as thrilled as I am when they read from her that tests are not the thing. And she's no longer doing the IB program. She's not doing the elite program, but she's following her passion, doing exactly what she should do, in my opinion, but that's not going to be shared by everybody. So that's just a little bit on how we're actually leveraging an agile mindset and growing an agile mindset here at the school. And I hope that you'll have some questions for me and some discussion. Just a few resources to mention first. My own website there first, and then Agility is with a colleague who came out of IT, and he's a software guy, and also a Buddhist, and we've put Agility as an agile mindset broken into practices. So he was quite adamant that we follow probably the original manifesto a little bit in preferring one way over another, but not saying that any particular thing is bad. It's just that if you have a choice, go for a little bit more of this over that. We have 10 different things there. And of course, every time we talk, we think of other things that should have been on the list. Peak Challenges has some blogs, and there's some blogs further on about those ideas. Scrum Alliance now has a certified agile leader, K-12. I was on a small team that developed that a couple of years ago. It's live, and people can actually request a course or bring a course into their schools. The Agile Research Consortium that Jeff mentioned, that came out of that work with Scrum Alliance. There was a couple of us that wanted to gather together the history of what research has been out there about agility in schools. If you want to take a look at that, I did the best job I could of pulling some of the early stuff in back to maybe 2005 or so. And of course, the early stuff was very much in the software world, and then at universities, and then slowly crept out into other areas. We're hoping that we get people submitting research as they work on it in schools. So if you want to take a look and share that with people, that'd be great. Otherwise, at the bottom, you have more information about the programs we're doing here, the Educational Research Center, but more importantly, probably the EDGE program on the bottom, describing just a little bit of what it looks like, at least for us, when we share an agile mindset and then try to build classes so that we're letting the students pull, letting them find their own motivation, focusing on student agency, and focusing really on transferable skills over the content, right? Content's important, but the transferable skills are more important. And it's a message that 5 years ago, I didn't say openly at the school. Then I started to say in some cases, it could be the fact that, and now I just say the skills are more important. Content's great, also necessary, but doesn't transfer the same way that learning how to give good, solid feedback or learning how to accept feedback does. So that's what I got. If you have some questions, I'd be thrilled to have a little bit of discussion.
So questions for Paul?
Hey, Paul, thank you for that presentation. I've just got a quick question.
Yep.
I mean, it sounds like what you said is you basically can't get real autonomy without genuine purpose in learning. Did I pretty much get that right, or was I wide of the mark?
I think that's right. And we struggle with it a little bit because we do give some work, of course, that is, this is stuff you have to do. And then we don't have quite that autonomy anymore. But yes, that's where we try to head.
And so I'm struck then, you're telling that story about that young woman where she made some sort of assertion about the quality of her learning. And then you're like, yeah, but I'm not sure about his dad. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because I'm just you said something in there that feels important, but I couldn't quite figure it out when you said it at the speed that you said it.
I didn't quite get it, Simon. This was about the person who's going to culinary school now. She came to the realization that it wasn't about grades, it was about doing what she really loved to do. That's
And
what I
you
meant.
were pretty sure that the dad wouldn't agree.
I'm pretty sure that the parents might have a different opinion, right? They sent their daughter off to a very high-priced Swiss boarding school as Korean parents. I would not be surprised at all if they're thinking, what the heck happened to our plan? She was supposed to go over there and get the best scores possible and get in the best university possible. Now she's going to go to a culinary school in Switzerland. What is she thinking? Right? That's quite possible. But I haven't heard that from them. I'm just guessing that that's a possibility. Or if it's not her reality, it's going to be the reality for some folks. If I'm turning kids off from taking the elite program because they have now found that they are their own agents in a traditional school setting, I'm going to have some issues with that.
Mm-hmm. And then just one question about Montessori. If you were to say Maria Montessori's name in your school, would people go like this or like this?
They'd be okay with that. I think most people wouldn't know a lot unless they had worked in one. Okay. Teacher education, you probably run across a unit on Montessori. But heck, by the time you're actually teaching, what do you remember? What do you know? But people know in general. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
If you can say the M word safely there, then you can back into half of those things that you're prioritizing rightly in terms of agility under the umbrella of her empirical claims about student development.
Sure. No, we can get away talking about Waldorf. So we're okay. Yeah.
So you have space to move in. That's good.
We do have some space. Yep.
All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, I found it interesting how you pointed out the parent pressure. Where do you see that coming in as a role? Because I do find it very intriguing. This is at the very beginning of the pandemic, one of the student groups that I worked out of the Baltics that they uncovered. And I got really interested, as they went through the process and learning a lot of the creative problem solving tools, unpack that many of them were concerned because they didn't have a purpose. They were never allowed to explore their purpose as students, and that was causing them their greatest anxiety. And that came out through our exploration of kind of setting up them for their individual projects. And it was really interesting to me to see that. How much of that pressure, not just from the schools, but from the families, do you think take away that sense of student agency, and how do you balance that then?
It's interesting. I would say I'm protected here because it's a boarding school and there are very few parents who are here very often, and during COVID, none. So
right, okay.
I'm quite protected because I got a lot of space there. But I've been doing this before with a middle school that we developed, and then now with this. So for the last 5-6 years, this has been really my focus. And I would say there's plenty of parents who take a while to warm up, but then later on have said, we really appreciate what you're doing because we've noticed a change in our child, right? Willing to take things on. But it's like teachers get nervous when you say, don't believe everything. In fact, I gave this speech to the 11th grade a couple of weeks ago, and then the following speech, which was supposed to be for the 12th graders, was promptly canceled because I was sending the message of you gotta question your teachers, right? You gotta not just jump when they say jump. It doesn't mean that you do that disrespectfully. You have to also learn the 21st century skill of negotiating and being respectful and so on, right? At the same time. Yeah. But people do get nervous because the first gloss is like, oh my God, you're telling the kids to riot and not respect us and so on. That's not the case at all. I had one other example for what you're saying, but it has slipped my mind in the meantime. So.
Okay, anyone else?
I think Nadine had a question originally. I saw your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly mention that I noticed that there, there's sort of this old adage of the autonomy, mastery, purpose mindset that went into it. And instead of saying mastery, you shifted gears. And I think that there's something that I was thinking about recently when I heard it brought up again, this autonomy, mastery, purpose sort of theoretical framework, which you changed the mastery piece of that. And I think that's part of the agile framework, from what I understand, is that it's not focused on necessarily mastering and checking all of these boxes, but it's instead focused on sort of the process and experiential piece of learning. Yes. And the other piece that I will say, so these are just reflections that I'm saying out loud for everyone's here, so for what it's worth. But the other reflection that I had is that purpose, I think, is a really, as important as it is and as critical as it is to find something that drives us and fuels us, and that we can get into that beautiful flow. And there's tons of, research about flow, and someone brought it up in the chat. So I think but I think not everything has a whole lot of meaning, and there's a lot of boring things we do in life, and there's a lot of things that we have to tolerate and manage on a day-to-day basis that are not interesting or fun. And I think that part of the process of teaching in a manner that we're getting people to go through something that, yes, we have a purpose for the end goal, but there are tasks along the way that are not going to be interesting and not going to be fulfilling to the same extent as the purpose that drives us to get there. And there's a bit of what we talk about in mental health of creating inertia before you have momentum, before you have motivation.
Yep. The people will put up with a lot of really boring tasks if they have something that they're trying to get that's not boring at the end. Right? Someone who really wants to learn French will do an awful lot of really pretty tedious work if they really want to learn French. Or
if they see the bigger picture.
You see the bigger picture. That's part of what we should learn to help people out. I think I'm out of time, but I want to mention the first thing you said too. I think I touched on it briefly. I think you said it better, but the concept that we've been working on is something we call SLAC. It's one of our 10 agility principles. And in SLAC, this is what schools generally don't do. And in fact, I've been a teacher trainer for a long time. One of the things that you hear all the time is how important each instructional minute is, and can't waste a minute, and so on, which pretty much means that you're holding hands and trying to get students to do exactly what you'd like them to do so that they maximize all the time that they have. SLAC is the opposite for us. It's that group that's sitting on the couch that can't quite get their act together. And it's the process, and it's the learning how to get your act together. But you can't learn it unless you have time to recognize that you don't know how to do it. And so we talk about that a lot. We need to have the ability for that group to founder so that we can debrief what they really experienced. Because if we just say, well, if I wouldn't hold your hand all the way, you wouldn't be able to do this, but they never experienced it, it's not the same conversation. So
that's exactly it.
Yeah, it's really focusing, as you put it, I think, as focusing on the process and learning the process that you're actually going through.
Yeah.
I think that's my time, Jeff, so I don't want to go.
No, that's fine, because I think that does lead us, right into our next presenter, Nadine. Which is like, we'll just let Nadine keep talking at this point.
Just let me keep once I get started. Just let me keep going, Jeff.
But at some point, right, you start presenting, and it's like, wait, what happened? Right?
How did this happen? All right. Let me see here. Let's see. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah. Does that work?
Yep.
Because I'm going to switch to a different screen for myself, and I'm not very well versed on this program. Okay. So, I used to be a school director. I've been in nonprofit work and mental health for 18 years. So a lot of my work, has been in solely on mental health, some of it with a lot of crossover in education. But I switched over to, quit all those jobs and switched over to designing a model for prevention, because for me, over time, it was really kept reflecting on a very simple concept, which is we've got to get ahead of these problems. We're just kind of in crisis mode all the time in mental health. Where it ties into schools is that This is our framework for working with children in a professional capacity every day. So this is our best, opportunity to provide resources, and also where we're seeing a lot of the crises exist, and for a lot of the reasons that you guys are working to change the model of education altogether. So this is just a focus on the mental health piece, where we're working on a salutogenic approach to mental health rather than this response-based model. So I'm going to start with a patient story to kind of share the current outlook, because I think that gives us a way of looking at things a little bit better, and then we'll go into, where we're going with it. I'm just going to quickly double check. So you guys can see that I switched that slide. Just give me a thumbs up or no. Yeah, so you can, okay, because I'm on a different page. So I just want to make sure that we're all following along. Yeah, okay, good. So before I get into the story, so this is sort of a framework that I just modeled out for this presentation. So hopefully we can just see it in this way really briefly because of the short amount of time. Right now, we're kind of looking at it from before I start with this patient, we're looking at it from a risk factor standpoint, then what negative or adverse life events they have. Then we are seeing an average of 11-year delay before we're addressing problems after we have a diagnosis. And then we're resourcing, creating treatment plans, or looking at their profile and how we can support them, measuring some outcomes, see their experience, kind of starting this process all over again, right? So this is the response-based intervention model that we have going on right now. In a lot of ways, it kind of mirrors how we're, delivering education, sort of this push model, and waiting for things to happen before we address them, like waiting for a student to have, miss school assignments or things like that. But because, 50% of our students have chronic stress by 14, they are at risk for the type of future that I'm about to talk about. So we're going to take this 29-year-old male, suffers from depression, anxiety, neurological complications from mental illness, a substance disorder, and lives with his parents at this point. His early childhood, there was a lot of sensory dysregulation, some hyperactivity, some disruptive behavior. Mostly disruptive behavior was at home. So what the school saw was the student who was a bit dysregulated at school, having some social problems, some odd social behaviors. In middle school, he had some bullying, but he was managing, he was getting his work done. So from the school perspective, it was push him along. And, he was really struggling to keep up with a lot of those social nuances, had a hard time fitting in, this growing social anxiety, feeling, inadequate, starts to develop some depressive thoughts. What wasn't considered at this time was that his mother had severe anxiety disorder that was untreated. So this wasn't brought to the table. And when he was younger, he would scream and cry and throw himself to the floor. His mom would feel very distressed when he wouldn't do general things like brushing his teeth, or seem to ignore directives or become hyperactive. So she got so concerned about her behavior that she just kept seeking medical attention over and over again. And so he went through testing and testing and testing, and they ruled out some learning disabilities and behavioral disorders. But the message that this young man kept getting is, something's wrong with me. He became more insecure, more feelings of inadequacy. The teachers were unaware of his conditions, which turned out to be later in life ADHD, sensory dysregulation disorder, and some social processing that went along with the ADHD. So he often had consequences in school for his condition, right? So calling him out, felt some shame in front of his peers, calling out for his inattention, distractibility, his sensory regulation coping skills, like covering his ears. Take your hands off your ears, pay attention, right? So his peers started to see him as a bit odd and unmanageable. And by high school, he was in therapy, started in therapy. He found a group of friends where he felt some acceptance and belonging finally. Not a lot, a lot of times this is where we see some of the worst cases, but for this period of time, it gave him a little hope, a little bit of a sense of belonging. And you can see some statistics up there of what percentage of students are experiencing depression, anxiety, and behavior disorders by age at the bottom. So by college, he started taking a lot of risks, because now he's away from his peer group that he finally had felt a little bit belonging. And he became sort of this party fun guy, right? And the fun guy takes a lot of drugs, started using cocaine, partying heavily, drinking a lot of alcohol. And like many students, 80% are feeling daily stress, 30 to 40% relationship problems. And he was among that group taking psychotropics at this point. This is when he started, seeing a psychiatrist, but internally he's really suffering. He did not feel accepted for who he was. He didn't have a sense of belonging. He didn't have a sense of purpose. He didn't have a sense of healthy relationships. This led to a lot of, he wasn't coping with his childhood stressors. This led to a lot of anxiety. And he started abusing some of the medication that he was given for ADHD. At this point, he was given Adderall for ADHD. He sold some of it, he took some of it, and started abusing it. So lucky for him, he did not end up in, oh, yes.
If I could just interrupt you, we're still seeing the where we are slide.
Oh, you're not following along with me?
Well, assuming that you're looking at something else, no.
Yes, I've been let's see here. You're on.
We're on the where we are. So the 11-year gap, observe.
Oh, okay. How's that?
Much better and much more relevant. Yes.
So let's see. So we missed a bunch, but let's see here. So you missed this slide just to quickly show you that frame that I was mentioning earlier. And now can you see this one? This is the college one that I just went over.
So now still seeing the 37% of people incarcerated.
Ah, okay. So for some reason it's not catching up.
Okay, now beer pong.
You seeing the beer pong now? Okay.
I see beer pong.
Okay. So now
Assuming that's what it is.
Yes, it was beer pong. That was where we were talking about the college students' stress. Okay, let's see here. Let me see if I can kind of look at these both windows at the same time a little bit so that I can make sure that it's catching up. Does that make sense? All right.
Sure.
All right. How's that? Are we all on beer pong?
Yes.
Okay. So now, I was just talking about this slide, which was, 37% of people are incarcerated, who are incarcerated have a diagnosed mental condition. So, but lucky enough for him, he did not end up in jail. After he graduated from college, continued to have drug and relational problems, abusing Adderall, started working in jobs, started, feeling pretty inadequate, trying to reach those same measures that he did in school, achievement measures, and using Adderall to try to produce greater work. And so he felt like the only way that he could do well was if he was high. So he went to the ER at one point for medication support, and they rapidly detoxed him from an anti-anxiety medicine. It was a benzodiazepine for anyone familiar. And he suffered physical withdrawal symptoms. At the same time, he assaulted his roommate for having a sexual relationship with his girlfriend. He no longer trusted his current relationships, had no one to turn to for help. He ends up in rehab. His parents, at this point suggested rehab. So now he's angry at the doctors for prescribing him Adderall at a level that he could abuse. He's angry at doctors for not supporting him better, finding him better ways to cope without medication. He's angry at his childhood experience for not getting him the help that he needed earlier. And at this point, there's a lot of statistics on this page, but this was the worst of his illness. And a lot of people experience the worst of their illness at the early adulthood age. And this is why we can kind of push kids through education and get them to this adulthood level and then have sort of these catastrophic events. But even with that, 7 kids kill themselves by suicide every day in the US. So we still have quite a bit of really serious outcomes even before that. But so then he spends the next 5 years incapacitated by his mental illness, not even able to get out of bed because the neurological condition is worsened by medication use. He sees about 25 specialists. He becomes chronically ill, as many people who have mental illness do, because his neurological issues become so severe that he cannot shower without severe pain and discomfort through his body. This condition was mainly undiagnosed because it's all connected to the psychosomatic body-mind connection. And they don't know how to diagnose nor treat this. So now he's at very high risk for suicide because he is extremely depressed. His health anxiety is so high that he thinks pretty much the best option for him is I either live with this condition forever or I kill myself. So during this 5-year period, he took about 18 different medications, up to 9 medications at a time. We often end up prescribing cocktails of medication to people with severe mental health conditions. He's isolated from his friends during this period, so he's feeling very lonely. Of course, that's also connected to worsening depression. And he's living with his parents. So they've been cooking for him, paying his bills, cleaning his, at this time, it was not known that he's now living at home and aware of his mother's anxiety disorder that he wasn't aware of when he was young. And his father's working full time, just trying to hold the family together. So 3 years ago, we finally started him on an integrative track. I started seeing him. We started, coalescing with all of his medical providers. We revealed this undiagnosed sensory processing disorder from childhood. We revealed this poorly treated ADHD and worked on a lot of different mechanisms to support him. We tried to bring back hope in the medical process because we needed the teams. Recovery really wasn't a straight line for this guy. At one point, we were looking at applying for disability, and this was only months before he really restabilized. So when we get to such a severe level, what we're seeing is that we are not able to help in a very in one framework, right? We have to then address it extremely nuanced, extremely specialized approach, and we have to hit it from all angles, right? So his condition costs his family up to $40,000 a year. And then hospitalizations and rehab. This contributes to the cost of $1 trillion to the global economy and lost productivity. And he's one of many who, for a long time didn't work and has risks to the economy and his own financial stability, which is, again, another risk factor for depression. So we got him to a place of stability, and just prior to his stability now, he started a part-time job, and he was part of this population of people who are experiencing, this lack of support from their supervisors, feeling emotionally drained, don't feel safe to come to work. So he started a job experiencing all this, and invoked a lot of his fears and adequacy in himself. But thankfully, because he was in therapy and doing fairly well, we were able to regain some hope, and he's starting a job. And he's starting to recover. But what he has to contend with now is that his depression will reduce his cognitive performance, just like everyone else's depression, by an average of 35%. And 71% of adults in the workplace are reporting at least one symptoms of stress at this point. And he'll be among the ones with financial stress. So he has got more risk factors than he would if he was treated from a young age, and if he had some prevention strategies. So now finally that he's in a stability period, we can move towards prevention for him for risks. But 3 years ago, when I quit my job as a clinical director of crisis and response programs, I was a director of schools. I stopped all of that to create a framework to get ahead of these problems. I studied the research for what is mental ill health best practices and what are well-being best practices. And I synthesized it all to make sense, to come up with these 5 elements, to get ahead of the problems, try to find those markers that are going to help prevent some of the risk, and then the inevitable risks that we experience, try to help them from turning into mental illnesses that require this long-term intervention. We practiced some of this in the school that I worked in. We had some serious behavioral issues. It was a non-public school for kids with severe social emotional learning disabilities. And we practiced a lot of this prevention model and tested a lot of it out, which is great for my work and helped frame my desire to get back into this and to help schools have this framework. So if you remember the first slide where we had the risk factors and negative or adverse life events prior to resources, imagine that we're just switch it around, that we give external and internal resources first, that we're always doing a constant needs assessment and gap assessment in wellness and those well-being criteria that I just developed that I'll get to. And we're looking at their genetic profile, their demographics, and all the things that may go into these, their risks and their problems, so that when they experience a negative life event, as we all do, or an adverse life event, because we have 1 in 6 have had a 4 ACEs score as an adult, so that was childhood experiences that were severe, like violence, or a parent who was a drug abuser, or a parent who had a mental health illness or anything like this. So if we could do that, and then we have a 0-year gap when those things happen, because we notice them right away, because they've already have those resources. We use the 5 elements for resourcing. Then we really feel like that we can reduce the risks. What does that look like? So how will we get there? This is the model that I designed as sort of like a quickest snapshot. We have 5 elements. They are framed. I like to use visual strategies because it's a complex thing and they're all interworking, but the spaces are anchors, so our internal and external security. You can see how they're broken down into a psychological and sociological framework. So what we can resource internally and how we can resource externally. So if we were to apply this to the story that I just told, what schools would land on is that chasing down these crises can't possibly provide all the support to each child once the serious illnesses exist. And we have the problem we have in schools where we're needing more counselors. Our teachers are getting burnt out. They have their own stressors to deal with. They're not able to resource independently as well. So we're using this model. So, and I can go through what each of these are at a later time if anybody is interested, how we actually get to the frames of what the elements include. In addition, we're adding on the 10 areas of risk assessment. So if we understand what these are in advance, we can make sure that the systemic areas of well-being, this framework within the school or organization or wherever we're trying to shift, meet the risks that are highest for that group, and that's measurable. And the other thing we need to add is areas of integration. So we would be remiss if we didn't consider the trauma considerations and neurodiversity, cultural considerations, the caregiver integration piece and such. So I will just briefly show what some of the components of each of these elements are. So you can think about the patient when you're looking at these things. So if you think about the anchor, if this patient had the ability to have some self-awareness and self-compassion, which we had to work on in therapy for years, security, a sense of agency, which you guys talk a lot about in agile frameworks, self-assurance, and an unconstrained ability to meet his needs, or had some protection in his environment, a sense of belonging and connection, a lot of the things that he didn't have if we examined those and filled those gaps earlier. The vessel is, well, a lot of people are talking about how the body and the somatic reaction and somatic memory holds in the body and is experienced in the body. So if we're assessing and figuring out how we can regulate our bodies early on, both internally and in the external environment, like sleep and nutrition, basic things, digestion, we can then again regulate the system, get the system to a place where it can have a foundation of coping beforehand. Currency is how we can place our worth on something. And I think it was Gautam who was talking about, what is meaningful and valuable, and we place it on money and material things. And you had mentioned that it's actually, you get some time. Well, time and meaningful impact, feedback, all research shows that these are the things that externally are valuable to us, and internally what is valuable to us. Our core values, our joy, our worth, our capacity, our character. The compass is how we make the decisions. What is our decision-making process? How can we not be paralyzed by the conflict and challenges, adversities that we face, and have a real clear internal decision-making model and external decision-making model for managing and resourcing. And this is really helps us avoid comparison and insecurity and the should statements. Setting boundaries, having self-direction, having healthy habits, considering the influence of others, not in terms of judgment, right? And the last is telescoping. So how can we, in the groups that we are part of, build rapport, understand our role, have alignment, collaboration? How can we internally have some flexibility, understand our vulnerability, and have some perspective, and so on? So we can apply this model to a whole school culture, which is what we're doing this year. We're starting to apply this to a whole school culture. There's a lot of disruption in education right now. I think it fits very well with agile frameworks, which is why I love Jeff's work and everybody who's doing work around that. And you can imagine giving a student a project in health around nutrition impact on the body and brain, or a social science project on what impacts mood, or a curiosity writing project on activities that repair the brain, like sleep or meditation, photobiomodulation, things that they wouldn't then expand their awareness, right? So we can integrate a lot of these principles into the framework of discovery and an exploration mindset, which I really love. And I think the other thing we can do right now is start to look at it from our own lens. How can we assess our strengths and our gaps in these areas personally? And I do some personal workshops for professionals, and those have been really strong in being able to then, once we're able to use those practices ourselves and realize the struggle and the challenge in filling those gaps, we have that empathy and be able to help lead groups within our classroom or anywhere else. So, you know, what I'm doing is personal workshops, school workshops, and a school full year coaching program coaching model. If you want to talk about this more, schedule a meeting with me. This is my website. Or if you want any of the materials around some of this, I can also give you a self-assessment that you can use independently if you'd like. I'm happy to share that with anybody on the call if you want to just request information, or just send me an email. These are the references for the statistics. If you want any of these links or more information, you can also just, because I know these are not clickable on your screen right now. So if you want to, if you need any of these stats or want to kind of look into this more, you can certainly let me know and I'll share these with you as well.
Right. And with your permission, Nadine, we'll actually go ahead and probably, if it's okay with you, add a link either to the deck or give people the ability to download your deck.
Yeah, sure.
The speakers page that we have on our website, so that, we're also going to carve out the video presentation. So, that'll live there forever. So people will always be able to go back and visit. So anything else you'd like to share with us, we're happy to go ahead and put on that link. Any questions for Nadine? Thank you so much. That was very, very informative.
Hey, Jeff, Story. I'm enjoying you now in video. Nadine, that was an excellent presentation. And I just think that it was so good to have you included in here, because I think that the whole education system is behind in realizing that this has to be a proactive process. And like you said, it shouldn't be coming after the fact. It should be coming, before the fact, because when you imagine that a lot of our children are making a major life change when they go from high school into college, and they're not prepared for that in a lot of cases, because they're flying the nest. They have so many responsibilities and stressors on them. And I'm just curious, like, do you know now in the college system, is this like a very, is this something that is there now presently, or are you finding that it's just, people are just now catching on and saying we need to have these resources available for our children? Because in most cases, like most colleges before the pandemic, they had a career counselor, and it was probably one person, and they're done at 5 o'clock. And in some cases, these students, they might be contemplating suicide at like 2 in the morning, and there's no resource for them. So
Yeah. It's all response-based story to answer your question, but it is more robust response-based than it used to be. So for example, now there's a 24/7 call center at MIT, for example. I happen to know that what they're doing. There's a 24-hour call center. They have security. They will come meet you at any time, right? But it's all only once you're contemplating suicide, right?
Yeah.
Once there's a problem identified, it replicates almost exactly what schools are doing. Schools are doing the same thing. They're boosting up their response-based interventions. They're trying to hire more counselors. They're trying to train their staff in finding the problems and identifying the problems. But we don't have a clear idea of what risks are. Nobody, if you ask any school leader, like, and I've asked many over the last 2 years in this research, what are the risks for mental health? You will get a different answer. How are you looking for risks? A different answer. How are you getting ahead of the problems? A different answer. And mainly they think they're doing it. They think they're doing it. And this is sort of the scary lens, because these numbers are really, really bad and they're worsening and they're dangerous. And my own personal school experience and mental health and going into college, as you mentioned, I had some counter transference when you said that. I was like, oh yeah, I remember going into college, right? So I don't think that anyone is immune to adversities and obstacles and challenges. Like, we will all hit them. It's just when. And if we don't have a foundation in order to cope and build resilience and build, resource internally and externally, we can't do it. We just won't be able to do it independently. We will need a lot of intervention, like the young man that I described.
Well, I just want to thank you, because the only college that I recognized was doing a proactive thing was Johns Hopkins University. And we all know them, that they're very foremost in healthcare.
Yeah.
So I saw, like, about a year before the pandemic came on, that they were starting to put these programs in place. And I think the best thing we can do is, like, take a model like that and see what works for everybody else and try and roll that out. So but thank you for joining us, because that was really a great presentation. I appreciated that.
Thanks, Tori.
Okay, any other questions for Nadine?
Hey Nadine, this is Simon. Thank you for your presentation. It would be helpful for me to get a little bit of a sense of what happens after a college or university calls you, just so I can understand what does that interaction sequence look like as the program comes in.
Yeah, so just to clarify, I don't work with colleges. I work with K-12 schools. Okay. So I know Dory was asking about colleges, but I personally am working with K-12 schools, because we are seeing the impact of these things before age 14. And so ideally, we're working with elementary and middle schools, and then we're continuing to resource in high schools, right? Because at high schools, we're already missing a lot, literally half of students at that point will have chronic stress. So we're already going to miss half if we don't start before high school. So that's why I started here. And your question is, how are we doing this model?
So specifically, there are two school boards that I sit on. Both schools could benefit from this.
Yeah.
For me to help facilitate that happening, I need to understand a bit about, if one of these heads of schools calls you and says, hey Nadine, we heard this presentation, like, how do we get started? That's what I'm curious to know.
Yeah, so I've been having calls with schools, and I'll tell them a little bit about the framework. We're doing a 3-day workshop on a really in-depth version of this and a needs assessment for their school. So figure out how they can do it and actually go through their risks, go through their needs assessment, go through, we have a needs assessment on those 5 elements so they can see where they're at, both strengths and gap areas. And then we go through a weekly, ideally about 20 to 30 weeks, depending on how much they can give me, for the whole school year. And we coach them through the model, and we go through a grounding phase, a relief phase, and a shift phase. So first we try to ground the elements, then we try to provide some relief to those elements, and then we try to shift them so that we're scaffolding, because we are, breaking this down. I like to break things down into, sort of a ladder or a map for schools. And then essentially we're we're allowing that school ambassador that we're training to design their own model at the end and see if they, and leave them capable of doing this year over year. Our goal is to kind of work our way out of a job with schools and not to, for them to need us, because we're trying to, one, have a large reach, and to empower the capacity of already these school experts to be able to do this within their school. So we're really teaching this foundation and the framework and the process.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Nadine. We're going to have to move
Thanks,
on to
Simon.
our next speaker. And so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Hannah Siddiqui. You're up.
Hi. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for having me. I do have a meeting in 15 minutes. I have to run in 15 minutes. But I'm here to share my story with you so that you can try Agile education for yourself. It is a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation, Nadine. So my name is Hannah Siddiqui, and I'm the founder of Agile Education USA. I've been using Agile in the classroom in higher education for a couple of years now. I'll be sharing some of the findings from my case study of what is Agile and can it help improve student engagement and retention. So before I talk about the case study and the findings, I wanted to share some statistics from the satisfaction with K-12 education in the USA. And this survey, the data is taken from 2000 to 2020, and you can see the total percentage of satisfied and total percentage of unsatisfied rates. And just notice this, since 2000 to 2020, the total percent of satisfied is below 50%. There is another survey. I collected these surveys from Gallup. This was, the survey was done between 5th grade to 12th grade students. And there were 3 questions in the survey. In the last 7 days, I have learned something interesting at school. I have fun at school. At the school, I get to do what I do best every day. And notice the percentage. As the grades are higher, the percentage of, in the last 7 days, I have learned something interesting at school. I have fun at school. At the school, I get to do what I do best every day is actually lower. So in other words, higher the grades, the student engagement, overall engagement is lower. So I'm in higher education. I'm a graduate professor. I teach MBA graduate and postgraduate courses. So these are some of the data to adequately address the barriers to the students face. We must first recognize that 21st century students do not fit the traditional profile. I have been teaching for a little bit over 10 years, and I can tell you that traditional teaching and learning never made sense to me. Since the very beginning of my teaching career, I was into non-traditional teaching methods, for example, project-based learning, query-based learning, experiential learning, so on and so forth. So let's take a look at the percentage. We have 52% students first in their family to complete college. We have 51% low to moderate income, 44% age 24 or more, 42% from communities of color, 30% attending part-time, 28% taking care of children or other dependents, 26% working full-time while enrolled, 18% non-native English speakers, 10% immigrants, and 5% active duty military personnel or veterans. So here's what some of the findings from my case study. This is a case study that is proven method for teaching and learning and is known to effectively boost student motivation in higher education. I'm going to give you a little bit of background of this courses that I taught. Well, some of the challenges we're facing was there were low engagement rates, there were absenteeism, latenesses, lack of motivation, students were unable to complete work in time. And this was a new concentration program, new MBA concentration program that was launched the first time in 2019, January. So this is a MBA major, but we're teaching business analytics. So it's a new program, new topics, and these are complex projects. So here are the data that that represents student engagement in the classroom, weeks 1 through 7. Winter 19, I used traditional teaching method. And as you can see, the average student engagement rates in the classroom is only 6%, weeks 1 through 7, which is concerning. I was concerned. And I knew I needed to do something because my students are extremely enthusiastic. They want to learn. And they're struggling to complete work on time. I knew it wasn't me. I know it wasn't my students, but I knew I needed to do something. So I was into non-traditional teaching methods, like I mentioned. So I thought of this particular situation. So these are MBA majors. We are teaching business analytics. They did not have the technical background yet. They did not have the math proficiency yet. And I'll tell you why. Because we use linear programming to do this type of analysis. So the students were struggling. So just like that. So my students are struggling to complete work on time. And these are complex projects. What better way I can help my students than Agile? I thought of it just like that. I knew about Agile. I had used it before. So the next session, next day, I came to class. I wrote Scrum on the board, big letters, without explaining too much what it is. I had my students gathered in the center of the classroom and we did a daily Scrum. And the wisdom behind doing an activity, standing up, doing an activity, one of my teachers used to tell us that, used to have us stand up and doing an activity. And he used to tell us that standing up, doing an activity, you would have access to creativity normally you wouldn't have sitting down. And the wisdom is evident. You should have seen the boost in the energy while my students were walking back to their workstations. And the very first time we used Scrum in the classroom, all of my students completed work on time. Since then, till today, I've been using Scrum in the classroom. We never looked back. So our success story continues. In spring 19, I used Scrum in the class, and the student engagement rate weeks 1 through 7 average is now 93%, which is a 32% increase. And in fall 19, I used EduScrum. And the average student engagement rate is now 94%, which is a 1% increase. Our success story continues even after that semester. This is winter 2020. Winter 2020, I'm still teaching the same courses, different groups. But this semester, winter 2020, in the middle of the semester is when actually the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, we were given a notification of we had to, do the entire transition from on-site to online within a week and a half, like about 10 days. And so while majority of our students, including our faculty members, our senior faculty members, were struggling. They were not familiar with the online features that, of our LMS system. All I had to do is to send out a few messages, announcements and emails letting my students know that, hey guys, we're going to be online. Because the students already had the foundation. They were using the framework. We were using collaboration apps. We were using all the online features because our students not only collaborate when they are in the classroom working with their classmates, they collaborate while they are away at home working on their projects over the weekends. So during that time, during week and a half time, what I was doing, I was helping other faculty members, some of the tools that I use and with the framework, with the framework they were interested. So also notice that during that semester, course 1 and course 2, these engagement rates is 100%. Well, in New York City that year, the failing rates, the dropout rates, and the student engagement rate was significantly low and heartbreaking. So this is pretty much all the time I have to share my experience with you today. So I want to end the presentation here. I want to leave some time to take questions if you have any questions, but I want to leave you with this question. That I'm in higher education, I'm an academic, I'm preparing students right out of, future workforce. How do we prepare our future generations so that they can take part in the complex work where uncertainty is the only certainty? I'm preparing my students to be agile. Am I doing enough? That's a question for you. If you have any suggestion, I'd be more than happy to have a discussion with you here. I have a couple of minutes. And then I apologize, I have to leave for another meeting. But thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you for your presentation and flexibility, Hannah. So any questions for Hannah? I know Paul had wanted to know if
yeah,
he
this
could.
is Paul. Yeah, let's see. If you're doing enough, I would say maybe the one other layer or another layer would be, are your students reflecting about how they're working with agility and how they would work with other methods and how they stack up against each other? Are they also looking at some of the research that you shared with us? Are they getting familiar with that? I suspect you're going to say yes to all of that. But I think those would be important things so that you're raising the awareness about why exactly you're using this, not just that you're using it and getting good results. But I suspect your answer is yes.
Yes, thank you so much. We are incorporating some of what you just mentioned, but not at the level that we wish to, because we are a small college. We are a small private college, but we are working not only their collaboration research institutes and research projects, but also academic and industry collaborations. That's something we are trying to expand and see if we can, because the student engagement rate is, we have done some work, the collaboration between academics and industry, and the student engagement rates were even higher. So that's is our, aim for now, and would love any support that you can, offer.
All right. Thank you again, Hannah. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's nice to see you guys. I see a lot of familiar faces. Hi, Simon. Paul, I know. David, we were on Clubhouse. Roz, hi. Dory, hi. Jeff, I'm so sorry. I have to leave. And
No. I completely understand. I appreciate it, though. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Bye. Take care.
All right, which brings us to the final presentation of the day. And then we'll be having our closing remarks from Simon. So, David, you have the ability to present if you'd like to take it away. You're on mute, though. So you're on mute, David. We can't hear you. You'll have to start everything and say it all over again.
There we go. All right, there we go. So yes, my name's David Hoffman. I've been in education, including, if I count substitute teaching, stretching back to about 2000. So been in here for a while, and similar to some of the speakers today, really, one, I got into education because I wanted to change it. I absolutely hated school as a student. Saw the just lack of choice, was constantly frustrated about not being able to really pursue things that I was passionate and having to do what I considered was mainly busy work. So I've been spending most of my career in teaching, finding ways to really advocate for student agency and student choice. I've done a lot of very tool-driven things. There's a Scamper matrix I've presented at several conferences and was hoping to present it at CREA this year, but with the pandemic and just other restrictions, unfortunately wasn't able to do that. So I'm going to share a couple of those tools today. Working on really getting this, Raising Innovation is the name of the LLC that I established. And the goal of that is to provide youth entrepreneurship training within the community, something that I infuse in my teaching and offer at this school where I teach in Virginia. So really looking to get some energy behind that. My master's degree is actually from SUNY Buffalo State College, where they have the International Center for Studies in Creativity. So a lot of these, names you probably hear linked with creativity. Obviously, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi was a huge influence for me. Dr. Gerard Puccio, I've worked a lot with Dr. Cindy Burnett, some of those people that have really driven creativity. And I know some people had mentioned kind of that reflection piece, which is really significant in the agile mindset as well, of the idea of, that's why we don't really focus on the mastery concept, because there's always something to refine. So using some tools there. This kind of cluster of what might look like a mess to you is what I call the solution stairwell. It's my riff off of a tool that I learned in creative problem solving called the ladder of abstraction. This is used really well, and I've had a lot of success with it with students, of really having them rethink the way they come up with hypotheses or thesis statements for their writing. And I've also found more recently the power it has in really driving them to clarifying things that they are passionate about. And this is from a student that I worked with last summer. I'd actually taught her in the classroom, and then she'd switched over to this private school. She heard that I was doing some stuff with innovation with students overseas and reached out and wanted to know what I was doing. And so her challenge statement started with this, and the tool works essentially in this way. You have your general focus of what that challenge statement is. You'll notice the wording of how might I. That idea of using might versus can is essential. That's what in creative problem solving they call STEM power, right? It's a great, very subtle, but super impactful mind shift for students and teachers. Because what it does from a teaching perspective, instead of asking your students, well, how can we do this? That seeks right answers. That immediately cuts out creativity and innovation, because it traps students in that thinking that, oh, I can only give right answers, and it limits that creativity. One of the significant reasons that Hannah just pointed out, that data around the fourth grade slump. And the reason students often feel like they're less creative, because they're, in a sense, beaten down by the traditional education system. We aren't promoting, even the language we're using often isn't promoting that kind of out of the box creative thinking. So this takes a little bit work, but honestly, even the STEM power I've used in my own classroom successfully, to the degree I had a couple of students come back, never explicitly taught STEM power. And they came back, remembered my birthday, and they had made me a cake with how might you on it rather than happy birthday, because that STEM had stuck with them from hearing it so often. And I thought that was just the most hilarious thing, because I'd never explicitly taught it, and they still picked it up and took that with them. But coming back to this tool, you start with the challenge statement, again, the power of the STEM power. And really what you do is each of these tiers, and I always try to keep 3 layers in every direction. So one direction, you just start with, well, why? And you ask the question, why? And you go, why else? Why else? And you explore. So you're stretching some of that thinking. And then you continue it down this kind of ladder of questioning. And I always joke, I was like, well, just pretend you're in, that stereotypical 5-year-old child that just doesn't stop asking why or how or why. And you stretch that thinking out until essentially it becomes so abstract that you're kind of repeating answers, and you're getting to these large thematic bases. And what you see here with the bolded, I also do it like this here. That's kind of the prioritization. So we do next, after we've stretched the thinking and we've done the divergent thinking. And for those that might not be familiar to, there are set guidelines that Alex Osborne came up with back in the 1920s. So I'm always very explicit with my students what type of thinking we're using. Are we using divergent thinking or convergent thinking? Right. Another thing with Agile is that mindset where you have to be very deliberate with what mindset you're in. All right. Because that idea of multitasking, no, you want to really focus on that. You know, what's immediately in front of you? What is that prior pushing towards that full goal, right? Or towards your ideal state. Sorry about that. I have. And is this the screen sharing here, right? Andrew, get notifications there from. Oh, geez. Sorry about that. Okay. So that's the STEM power. You can see this stretching of the thinking once they've gone through the whys, the hows, and the element that I added to the ladder of abstraction was the what, because I liked having some of the resources. This is what I often will have them go and then kind of transition to another tool that I often use called assisters and resistors, where they start to look at, okay, what resources do I have that might help me? Who do I know? What places could I go to? What physical materials do I have? And that was something that I always didn't like about the ladder of solutions, or ladder of abstraction rather, was that it didn't really delve down that lane as much. That's an element though, that if you find a student that this gets overwhelming, it's too much, pull it back. There's another simpler version of this even that's just called why, what's stopping you. And you go in one direction with the whys, and then you look at what's stopping you. And that helps, again, clarifying kind of that visioning portion of creative problem solving, where you're able to see some of those blocks. But coming back to that, so once we switch from the divergent thinking, where they explore all these options, then they do hits. And usually the direction there, again, I'll tell them the convergent thinking principles. So, okay, we're going to start selecting and strengthening ideas now. So the importance of staying positive. The number one thing that I find in schools having to kind of re-educate or retrain students' minds is to get them to not eliminate answers, not to go through the selecting process with, well, that's stupid, that won't work, this won't work, because that's an immediate creativity killer. Starting with that, be positive. Look for those unique ideas. Try to find, you know, that idea that stands out and is unique, and explore why it's unique and how it might work. And that's kind of that pull system. Another thing that I always do in facilitating this is I ask the students to also include one wild card, to choose one of the ideas that they wouldn't normally see themselves bringing forward and carrying that with them. And that tends to open up and keep a lot of the creativity and innovation fresh up front. And I've seen this, using this even for facilitation purposes with companies. That is extremely powerful. So keeping that open-mindedness to creativity. So that's how that tool works. It's very powerful in that selecting and strengthening. It's excellent too, because it gets them to record everything. You have a piece to where if they do pivot, now you have all this ideation that they can come back to and look to where they were and maybe explore a different option if they hit a dead end with something else. So using tools like that, having students kind of keep a journal and getting used to the habit of mind and that muscle memory of finding also the tools that work with it well with them, because I tell them all the time, I'm like, look, not all of these tools are going to fit your personality or your preference for creative problem solving. And that gets us into a little bit of like the foresight profile is based off of Dr. Gerard Puccio's work and Murdoch and Mance. And that's based on the idea that within the creative problem solving process, we have the clarifying phase, the ideation phase, development, and implementation, all right? And there's actually a whole survey that Dr. Gerard Puccio has called Foresight, obviously, that people can even take to find out their preferences. I've done this with my students in the classroom even, and it's really interesting that once they get their scores, how they're able to use that in collaboration. And also it shows them how to identify certain triggers, why they might start lagging energy. Ideators, for example, tend to really take off with a lot of ideas, but they really fall short in that implementation stage. They'll start to lag energy kind of usually between here, and they kind of get bored with a project a lot faster than some other people. And they'll just kind of drag and want to pass it off to someone else. So that idea of taking things to fruition, if you have a high ideator that you're working with, having them know that and understand and recognize why they're starting to drag that energy, it helps them kind of promote better, will really promote that understanding of, okay, well, here, this is why it's not getting done. It might even help them with that kind of mentorship or that collaboration process of identifying, I really could use to collaborate with a high implementer. So when I get to this phase, I can kind of hand off this portion of the project and keep that energy going. And maybe utilize that or leverage it in a way where, okay, what else do we need to create ideas around and do that? Okay. There's also different triggers that, you know, what an ideator might do or their preference, how it's going to trigger and create a breakdown and kind of that storming phase in collaboration. If we're looking at Tuckman's model, because an implementer might want to just take off and go. That's going to drive a clarifier crazy because they're going to still be, wait, we don't have all the details. I need to know this, 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 and this before we move forward. And by showing your students that, hey, look, these exist, like, these are preferences for a reason, but this is how you can avoid that conflict. You notice the groups just running seamlessly once they've really gotten a handle for this, and the lights just go off. I mean, I do this within the first week of school, and I have a few exercises that I run that just kind of pull them into it. And this is the model based off that foresight piece. So you just get that there. Any questions so far? I want to make sure that I get some questions in about these tools in case anyone's interested in using them or how to use them or when to use them.
David, I'm curious to know a little bit about how much of variability there is among students. In other words, when students find out what sort of type they predominate in, do they then, is the idea that they then like, okay, I want to be more sort of brought out and try to be other things, or they just like, no, this is my identity, this is who I am?
No, and that's when I facilitate it. Very great question. When I facilitate it, I'm very careful to stress this is not about ability. This is about your preference. You can, and that's crucial if you're facilitating this, because you don't want them to identify with those things. Just like, you know, if I have dyslexia, I am not dyslexic, right? So same thing here. I'm not an ideator. I have a high ideation preference, all right? And you can flip in this. You can learn how to do these things kind of better at any point. And you might, even, if I go into a different field of work, I might find myself having to do a lot of developing, and that preference might end up flipping, all right? So the power of this is really just improving teamwork and collaboration. And that's why a lot of these big businesses have paid a significant amount of money for this kind of facilitation. Because now where they have abused it at times is when the manager starts using it for hiring practices. That's frowned upon. You don't want to do that for that same reason, because this isn't a solid ingrained thing. People can learn. And it's really just about understanding the preferences and the triggers and how to leverage that for better teamwork. So great question.
Superb answer. Yeah, that's a superb answer.
Right. Cool. Any other questions about either that tool, any of the divergent principles, or how to use these in a classroom setting?
So I would actually, I'm curious, right? So I see that from a planning perspective. This is a very, powerful tool to help students get through that brainstorming phase, to come up with ideas, given that, that safe space to really experiment, even with thinking outside the box, right?
Right.
How do they get from there to what's next? Or is that just, look, that's a
So
different
that's the
part of
convergent
the,
phase.
okay.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's where you see some of these. So these are kind of like the hits, the bolded ones. We're like, this is what I might want to use. I want to leverage, this idea of social influence. How might I leverage that? And then you see them starting to plan that action. From there, I would often go to, well, it depends. If they're still at like 5 ideas, we might run it through an evaluation matrix. So converge, we have it down to a workable number of ideas. If there's a lot of ideas that they're hitting in, we're going to cluster that. All right. So we're going to form those clusters and then look at that, cluster that again if we have to. Because I've seen this stretch out where you're into the hundreds of ideas, right?
Right.
You might have to cluster that a couple times over, kind of generalize it a little bit, and like, okay, our energy's here. Let's focus on this for what we want to do with our next steps. And it really it depends on the flow of where that client is going. And that's the other thing too, is I tell my students within the first week, I'm like, look, I am not your teacher. I'm a coach. We're going to approach learning in a very different way. You're going to have a lot of the choice and the voice here. And I model, I'll do some scaffolding and kind of show them how through a couple of practice exercises, how to leverage that idea of like, here's our objectives, here's our standards. That's what you need to be concerned about right now. If you can figure out a way to bring in your own personal interests, skills, you can design almost any project you have, as long as you can show me how you're meeting these standards or objectives. And I coach them through that all the time, because at first it's so much choice that some of the students kind of freak out. They're just like, can you tell me what to do? But once they start to get the hang of it, then they get pulled in. And honestly, just today, I had a breakthrough with one of the students who's been struggling for this first half of the year. And in 90 minutes, just outlined an absolutely amazing project where we were exploring this concept of horror and the Gothic elements and how those can be used to create horror. And her and a classmate teamed up, and they're developing a restaurant concept using these elements, and already have started laying out a whole menu design and everything. It was fantastic. And I was like, okay, this is a student that I couldn't get to write an essay over the course of an entire week, and in 90 minutes just pretty much set up a whole restaurant design. So cool. Yeah, so if anyone wants to get a hold of me, I'll just share my email. If you're interested in any of these other tools, there's a plethora of others where this comes from. So
All right. Any other questions for David?
Hey, David, it's Dory. I have a quick one. I love this model, number one, because it's very visual. And I think a lot of our students now, they're used to being visual just because the world we live in and the generation whereas when we were in that same range, everything was audio, it was lecture, right? So I'm curious, like, do you see a lot of the students that you run through this model, do they go into entrepreneurship a lot? Because like, I think you had mentioned that this is something that it lends itself to entrepreneurship. And I can see, like, just with the example you said, that's someone like an entrepreneur thinks very differently than someone that wants to be a company person, right? So,
right. I think it does lend itself to entrepreneurship, but it's something that can be used. Just like agility, it's pervasive. It goes really, once you start learning and using these tools, you find yourself using that thinking method in every area of your life. I used these tools to figure out where I'm going to live next when I was moving and relocating for a job. I went through, did the evaluation matrix, figured out all the factors, boom, 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 and it streamlined it so quickly. Even just that STEM power, that using that kind of mindset in your communication with people, I wrote an article for Michael Fox's book on why study creativity. And it was about leveraging STEM power on how to be an effective teacher in terms of communicating and diffusing parent-teacher conferences where you get like the irate parent that's coming in there. And by using that and just that listening process of like, be empathetic. And by using the STEM power, it opened up to more opportunities. And I would just sit back and listen and let them go. And it was funny because the school in Maryland where I taught for 9 years, the one counselor loved it when I would come down for conferences. I mean, she's just like, she would just sit back and be starstruck at like, how did you just diffuse? Like, this is every year we have like hour-long conferences with these parents, and you were in and out of there within 10 to 15 minutes, and they were happy. How did you do that? And it's these kind of strategies. It was just using STEM power, it was listening. And then after having given them time to speak, showing that you're listening and saying, okay, this is what I've heard. These are the issues. Boom, 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 boom. Is there anything else? Usually there is. You let them go for another 3 to 5 minutes. And again, reiterate, okay, so I've heard this, this, and this. Is that everything? Once they confirm that, then you go into that almost just a debrief method, like a point, like the pluses, opportunities, issues, new thinking kind of thing. But what I do is I'm just like, okay, this is what I've done. This is what I can do. Are there any other suggestions that's worked in the past, or are there any other suggestions you have that I should apply? And once I've taken it through that ladder of thinking, you've covered everything. You've given them the say. And usually that's all the parents really want, is to know that they're being heard and to have a say and to know that you have a plan. And they've just had that voice. It's the same thing with educating with your students. You've just given the parents a voice. That's it. So, all right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you all.
All right. So with that, I want to thank all of our speakers, and we'll have our closing remarks from Simon.
Thanks, Jeff. So I really felt like I couldn't write the remarks until I'd heard what everyone said. So you can see, you know, like the quality people were talking and trying to just offer some sort of encouragement to folks. So the sequence here is gonna be a little bit funky. I don't know really any educators who got into education because they didn't love being around people who are in the process of learning. There were certainly a few in my lifetime. They needed a job, they were good enough. But when I think about the educators who really mattered the most, those are the people who just clearly love being in the presence of young people learning. And so we'll hear schools talk endlessly about how much they care about cultivating lifelong learners. And when you ask the people, what are the models that you use to create those lifelong learners, that's usually the moment when the hand waving starts, because they don't have one. It's not that they're bad people, but it's just hard to create a pull system for all the reasons that Paul has encountered and that David has encountered and that all the folks on the call have encountered. It's this weird thing because it starts with a pull instead of a push. And so it's weird because as teachers, we're also told we need to be in control of our environment. And the first thing we learn from our parents is push. If we have parents who are like most of our parents. So we're born into a push system, and then we have to transition to creating pull for our students because we know that lifelong learning is the thing that's really going to get them the farthest down the road. And so, David, when you wrote that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi died today, or I guess perhaps his death was announced today, it really made me stop for a minute, and it caught me up short because he really, you know, he was one of those people who like asked this basic question, you know, about, he understood this basic truth about flow states, which is essentially we crave them and they're good for us. And yet school seems indifferent to people experiencing them. How do we know? You build a pull, you build a push system, and you push people of whatever shape peg through a particularly round hole die, and then you hope for the best. I hope that makes some sense. When you think about, as an educator, being in a space and seeing lifelong learning. It's nothing really different than just sustained attention, joyful concentration, just being in flow of the sort that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi encouraged people to create for other people so that they can learn best. And so it's super encouraging to hear people on this call who are like, yep, got it, doing it, running into icebergs, flying into the iceberg again and again and again and again. And it's really easy to get discouraged because you know what that flow feels like. You have felt it yourself. You've seen your kids do it. You know that it benefits them. And yet you're being forbidden from creating flow in a push system. And so it's tempting to just get frustrated and be like, fuck this, and just start pushing because that's what you're in. Do your best not to do that in the schools that you care about. Because you have to really understand, how do you change a system? Fighting a push system with a push can't work. So you have to be creative. You have to find your people and pull together. Period.
Yeah, it's like, to be really, really successful, we have to suck and create a vacuum, right? That pulls
That's the
us
thing.
into it, right? You know,
And that's why you actually can celebrate sucking a little bit and being imperfect. So you get to suck in two ways. Both are awesome.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you. And thank you all. I really appreciate it. And we've got this recorded, except for the first couple of, introduction seconds, but that's just on me. And we'll make it available, and then we'll be cutting it up and putting everybody's presentation on their, speakers thing. I'll be getting all their thing, and just give us a little time to get that. I want to thank everybody for their great presentations. And, to Simon's point, we're all kind of pulling in the same direction, right? So, when possible, let's pull together, and we'll hopefully pull a little bit further and a little bit faster. And with that, we'll see everybody next year at this, whatever this is.
Thanks, Jeff, so much. Appreciate
All right,
everybody.
thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, Simon.